will say a quick word. It's great to be here on behalf of Arts Alliance as well. If you don't know AAME, we do three things basically in the community, one of which is all of which are aimed at fostering more awareness of and connection among the arts in our community, one of which is the A Magazine, which is probably our most visible product. Another is the Gala Arts Awards series that comes out every year in May. And then finally, a little speaker series that we run, which is supposed to be tonight with my colleague, Chris Slaughter. Chris, however, got the RSV virus and was told to stay home. So if you came expecting Chris and you realize I look a lot more respectable than Chris, and B, I'm not nearly as exciting, you have a chance to escape now. I'll give you that chance now to go. I have been working on the Scottish Reformation for a long time, and this is something that I was able to muster together at short notice since Chris told me yesterday he couldn't make it. But I've done some work on this for many, many years. So in a sense, I prepared this over about an hour. In another sense, I prepared it over about 25 years, depending on how you look at it. The Reformation in Scotland is the subject that I kind of backed into. When I was looking at PhD programs, I ended up going to the University of Edinburgh, and I lived there for 6 years. It's a wonderful town. I tell people now when they're going to go do a PhD, go find a miserable town, because then you'll finish faster. If you live in Edinburgh, you want to enjoy living in Edinburgh as long as you can, and I did. So while I was there, I initially had a topic that was going to be more based on the European continent, and it became clear to me, two things became clear to me early on. One is that my Latin was not good enough to do my original project. My Latin's not bad, but it's not that good. And the second thing was that I was right here in a city that had all the Scottish archives, and it made more sense to do a Scottish subject. And so I switched out of my original proposal to do something about the growth of Protestantism in Scotland up to 1550. You're going to get a lot of that PhD tonight, because it turns out that the back half of my title is a little bit of smoke and mirrors. I don't really know the Appalachian side, but I'm going to throw it out there because I think that there are resonances and connections between our region and these ancient roots. But my focus is really the 15th and 16th and 17th centuries, a long time ago, in order to get there. I'm going to go pretty fast in order to get through some material, and then if you have questions, bear them in mind, or you can stop me midway. I don't care how we do that. But in case I go too fast through something, it's perfectly okay to say, "Slow down, you maniac," and I'll try to put the brakes on a little bit. But I'm going to try and get through a lot of material and still leave some time for conversation at the end. So, Scottish roots of Appalachian religion. This is basically where I hope to go. We may have to prune a little bit as we go, but I'm going to begin with a little bit on medieval Scotland, just a little bit of geography and topography and weather and language, because it's important in order to get a sense for what's going on in the 16th century. We'll do a very, very brief overview of the way that Reformation theology came to Scotland and implanted itself there. We'll look particularly then at some things that I think begin to have these resonances in Appalachia. The role of the Bible is one. The role of preaching, and I'll focus a little bit on John Knox, the most famous person probably associated with the Reformation in Scotland, apart from Mary Queen of Scots. I'll then move on to something that is a theme, really, in Scottish Protestant church history, which is tension with secular authority. The relationship between kirk, and if you don't know that term, kirk is a word that originally means circle, but it's a word that is church. The kirk and the crown have a tense relationship, and we want to spend a little bit of time with that. And then a weird one, because it turns out that research I did a few years ago took me into the 17th century and into the strange world of the Scottish Presbyterian prophets. And that, it seems to me, has a kind of resonance as well with Appalachia, particularly with traditions of second sight. People who believe themselves to be able to predict the future, whether through visions or dreams or other things. We're going to find a strong resonance there. So 7 from Highlands to Highland is just there to be cute, and I'm going to leave that to you in question and answer. Also, the title, the Bible Fights, is a little crass, but I wanted it to rhyme so much in the title, and so I went there, and it does rhyme. So it doesn't rhyme well, but it rhymes. Also, the title, the Bible Fights, is a little crass, but I wanted it to rhyme so much in the title, and so I went there, and it does rhyme. So it doesn't rhyme well, but it rhymes. Scotland itself, according to a contemporary source, was at the Angula Mundi, the corner of the world, and for most people in the 16th century, this was the northwestern corner of most of what they knew, with a few minor exceptions. So if we look at a map of Europe in the whole, we can see that this is a country that is a little remote, but not that remote. And so to understand the place of Scotland in the Reformation era is to understand that it is both part of Britain as we think of now. This is why I'm glad I have the lapel mic on, I can move. And of course shares a border here with England. It's a hostile border, but it does share a border. But it's also pretty close to Scandinavia, and it's pretty close to the Low Countries down in here, and it's not too far to sail around to the coast of France. And so Scotland is, on the one hand, a little remote. It's not a major player in European politics. Its dynastic politics are not central. You get a couple of good political marriages for various Scottish monarchs, but not that much. But on the other hand, it is a part of European politics, religion, and society in the 15th, 16th centuries. So there's a sense of being remote, but it's also connected. As far as the country itself goes, a little bit on topography is important. The Highland-Lowland split is probably one you're familiar with. That split is very important for all Scottish history. And no matter what survey you read, it starts here. You have to start with the land. And that split is one that you can see pretty easily on a topographical map. The highlands are, of course, where the mountains come down here, and the lowlands are everything below it. So the Highland line effectively comes along the Grampian Mountain line, and then you come down into the lowlands, which is where the cities are, Glasgow and Edinburgh, and of course all the cities in Fife, St Andrews, Dundee, and so forth, and then the borders down here with the border with England. The northern part, as you can tell from here, is much more mountainous. Not surprisingly, that's going to mean a thinner population, and it's going to mean fewer towns along the way. The other notable feature here is, of course, the Great Glen, and if you've traveled, you probably know this. All the way from Inverness down Loch Ness into Fort William is this huge valley filled with lochs or lakes, very scenic, and possibly with a sea monster somewhere along the way. So that's the Highland-Lowland split. It's very important for us for a variety of reasons. And just because I have these, I'll show you how important it is to the medieval mind. This is a map, a medieval map made in the 13th century, so it's 1200s, by Matthew Paris. Look at the north of the map, and you can see the importance of the Highland-Lowland line. Look at the way he draws the map. Now, it's not accurate, obviously, but what you can see is the sea cutting deep, deep in on either side. This is the Firth of Forth, if you know your Edinburgh, comes in from the east, and the Firth of Clyde from the west that goes past Glasgow. And the way he's got it, it comes down to one bridge right in the middle. And that bridge is at Stirling. And if you know Stirling, you know that this is where both William Wallace and Robert the Bruce fought their decisive battles. It's where William Wallace won a battle called a Battle of Stirling Bridge, which inexplicably doesn't make it into Braveheart, an entire 3-hour movie about William Wallace. There's no bridge, but that's all right. But the Stirling is, this is seen as the kind of gateway between the lowlands and the highlands. It's a commanding position. If you ever go to that castle, you realize it's on a little volcanic plug, and you see for miles, and you can look at the Highland line running along to your north. I mean, it's visible as you look at that line of mountains. Here's another one. This map by John Harding. He's an Englishman who's trying to convince his king to go invade Scotland in 1457. And to do this, he makes a map. It's a confusing map because west is at the top. But again, if we look at this map, what we find is the same sense of the importance of the Highland-Lowland divide. These are the two firths. So here's the Firth of Forth, and here's the Firth of Clyde, and yet again, Stirling Bridge right in the middle. So conceptually, even though these are not accurate maps in the way we think of that, conceptually they show you how important this one feature is and how important that geographical divide is between highlands and lowlands. It's also important because the languages are different. In the Highlands, the language is Scots Gaelic. And if you see that word, for the Scots, you pronounce it Gaelic. For the Irish, you pronounce it Gaelic. And they're two related but separate languages. Scots Gaelic is an utterly different language from anything you and I know. It is a very different linguistic family. In the lowlands, you speak Scots, and Scots is very like English. It has some distinctive markers. There's a debate among scholars as to whether you call it translating or not when you work out of Scots into English. I do classes occasionally where we focus on 16th century Scotland, and I can teach my students in an hour to read Scots. It's not that it's pretty close to English. But it's a different language between these two, and it's a very different language between the highlands and the lowlands. In the lowlands, as I mentioned, that's where the boroughs are. If you see that in Scotland, it's borough, is how you pronounce it. I went to a concert once of a Canadian band called the Rankin Family, who were great, and the guy got up and he said, "It's great to be back in Edinburgh," and everybody kind of cringed in the audience. So if you go over and you're performing in Edinburgh, be sure that you say Edinburgh when you get there. In the lowlands, as I mentioned, that's where the boroughs are. If you see that in Scotland, it's borough, is how you pronounce it. I went to a concert once of a Canadian band called the Rankin Family, who were great, and the guy got up and he said, "It's great to be back in Edinburgh," and everybody kind of cringed in the audience. So if you go over and you're performing in Edinburgh, be sure that you say Edinburgh when you get there. So the boroughs are the towns, and they're in the lowlands. The highlands does not have much by way of towns. Social authorities also different. In the highlands, you get this complex interplay of old nobility, people with titles like Earl and Lord, along with clan chiefs. And sometimes they're the same person and sometimes they're not. And it gets very, very confusing to sort out because the clan loyalty can vie with or can even overcome your loyalty to your landowning lord. It's a very complicated system. That does not exist in the South. In terms of the North, the Highlands had a strong sense of independence from the Crown for a long time because they had their own strong lordship. This was from the clan MacDonald, who had a position called Lordship of the Isles. When the Lordship of the Isles finally is forfeited by James IV, the king, in 1493, it's a major blow to the political independence of the Highlands. But for a long time, they had a strong sense that they weren't really that involved with the person who was their king. One other note, by the way, there's no capital in Scotland at this time. There's only the Crown. This is one of the things that I got called on in my PhD defense. That's how nitpicky the guy was. He was called James Kirk, and he said to me, I had referred to the capital being Edinburgh. He said, "There's no capital. Wherever the Crown is, that's the center of governance." And it moves. It's a peripatetic court. It moves around. So in terms of the Highland-Lowland split, which is then going to come over here a little bit, I think, in some various ways, the first thing to bear in mind is that distance in the north is a lot greater. To get from place to place is a much more arduous and difficult and time-consuming task. And whereas in the south, you have a lot of travel by water that's possible. One rule of thumb in the ancient world is travel by water is always faster, always safer. And so that's possible in the south in a way that is more difficult in the north. The population is much thicker in the south than it is in the north. And trade is much more active in the south than in the north. So not surprisingly, the Reformation comes first to the lowlands. That's the place that has the connection to the European continent. That's the place where all the books are getting smuggled in. That's where the universities are. With the exception of Aberdeen. And so that's where these things happen. Scotland does have 4 ancient universities, by the way, 2 founded in the 1420s, St. Andrews and Aberdeen, and then Glasgow's a little bit later, and then Edinburgh, where I went, is a relative newcomer in 1582, I think. So I feel a little ashamed to just say that, 1580 something. So the Reformation in Scotland, I'm going to give you a couple of book plugs as we go. I brought these in case you want to have a look. I have a chapter in here. The History of Scottish Theology, Volume 1. Christmas is coming up. What better gift for your family and friends than all 3 volumes of this? I don't get anything out of the sale of this book, so don't bother with it. But anyway, most of my PhD is condensed into a chapter into that book, if you find it interesting to go through. The Reformation as a movement is far too complex to address here, but here are a few basic points of how this set of teachings comes into Scotland, and then I would propose is going to come with the Scots themselves to our region. The first and most significant thing by far is Martin Luther's teaching on justification by faith. This is without any question the most important marker for 16th century Protestantism in general. So important, in fact, that it's not limited to Protestants. There are people within the Roman Catholic Church who also are affected by Luther's teaching on justification by faith alone. But certainly for the Scots, this is the thing they embraced. And it's the first thing we see coming into the country as a sign that they had begun to encounter the teaching of Martin Luther. In general, those first traces of where that teaching comes in are with universities. There is one shadowy mention in 1520 or so of a man who came up with the Duke of Albany, who was a Scottish nobleman who spent a lot of time in France. And he later is going to be executed. But we don't know anything else about him. But we do know that at universities, the ideas of Luther are debated, and that's where he begins to have an effect. Luther, of course, his teaching is not initially, as far as he's concerned, all that earth-shattering. He thinks it is going to overturn the way you consider salvation. He does not see its implications for church authority. He does not see its implications for worship. He doesn't see its implications for ordained clergy. All those things are later on. Early Luther simply reads this as a way of understanding the relationship between an individual and God. But that's what's going to come in to Scotland, certainly by the 1520s, in the universities, and then it takes a while to get out, because how does an idea like that spread? The problem in Scotland is that the king, James V, is going to be pretty adamantly against Luther. Part of this is grandstanding, and this is not on my outline, but I should mention it. James, if we were to look at the royal perspective here, James V is going to be consistently, at least on paper, against the Protestants. And the reason is he's trying to win points with the Pope against Henry VIII, his uncle. So Henry VIII has gone and made his own church, and James writes to the Pope over and over again and says, look how well we've done. Those English, they let all this bad stuff in, but we haven't let anything bad in. And so James is able to use that as a way of getting some concessions out of the Pope. So Henry VIII has gone and made his own church, and James writes to the Pope over and over again and says, look how well we've done. Those English, they let all this bad stuff in, but we haven't let anything bad in. And so James is able to use that as a way of getting some concessions out of the Pope. So it's, the crown is officially against this. Now, the official Scottish Church is also obviously opposed to Luther. They don't have the authority to crack down, though. The only institution that can do anything physical in terms of punishing someone for belief is the state. And so as a result, anybody who gets accused of heresy has to be handed over to the state. So as far as James is concerned, he's got to be part of the equation for that to work. Now, going along with this, something that often gets put first in histories of the Reformation, incorrectly I think, is criticism of the church. The idea that anti-clericalism, which was rife in the Middle Ages into the early modern period, is part of the Reformation, I think is secondary. I don't think it's nearly as important as Luther. Anti-clericalism is criticism of priests, but especially ones who are supposed to be very holy, like friars, Dominicans, or Franciscans, the ones who are supposed to be half-starved and keeping vigil and helping the poor, and yet you see them lampooned over and over again. But it goes way back, much farther than the Reformation. And I'll give you an example you know. Stories that emerge in the 13th century about Robin Hood feature Friar Tuck. How does Friar Tuck look? A little like me. He has not been doing a lot of fasting. He has not been doing a lot of vigils. He's looking pretty well fed. And that's anti-clericalism. That is a kind of poking fun at the priests. Now, is it because people are wildly dissatisfied, or is it just funny? It's hard to say as a historian when you encounter sources like this. So one knee-jerk response is to say, look, everybody's fed up with the church. It's not necessarily the case. But there is some question about this, and some of those things are institutional. For example, in the Scottish Church in the 16th century, there is a system called commendatorship, by which somebody can get the income from a bishopric or an abbacy, which is a significant amount of income because they're major landowners, without being ordained. If the crown says, well, we haven't found the right person to fill this position yet, you can hand it over to one of your relatives, and they will draw the income for a long time, and this became something that was a bit of a scandal. People knew that this was not appropriate. Those individuals who are getting that money are not doing any spiritual work. And so there was a sense of, there is some anti-clericalism, therefore. Anyway, the way the pattern goes in Scotland is this. People will discover the ideas of Luther, usually in a university, because they had to discover them in Latin, right? They don't have them translated yet. So it's only if you're able to read Latin or to talk to somebody who could read Latin that you're going to encounter this. And once you do, if you're somebody who is learned, you might be a priest, you might be an abbot. We get records of a lot of people who start doing this. They start preaching. And the minute that preaching gets sniffed out, they're going to be faced with a choice, which is either you go into exile if you get found out, or you might be put on trial. Now, the trials are not that plentiful in Scotland. The number of martyrs is only about 20. It's hard to fix exactly in the 16th century, which is comparatively small. It's nothing compared to England, nothing compared to Spain, and nothing compared to France. But there are a few cases where somebody will actually be put to death for their faith. I'll give you a couple of examples in a moment. More often with the Scots, they'll go into exile. And if they are people who are schooled and educated in Latin, they can move. Because one of the only groups of people who are mobile in the 16th century are scholars. You could go as a scholar to any university in Europe because they all speak Latin. And so the Scots are going to go and people the universities of Europe. There's going to be one who accomplishes great things in Copenhagen. There's going to be one who goes to Leipzig and becomes a very distinguished theologian. One who goes to Marburg. They scatter themselves around other Protestant universities in Europe as they flee. Some of them are going to come back. And so part of the story of the Scottish Reformation is that these exiles, some of them are going to come back, many don't. But the real story is the people who never show up in the records. And these are the people I tried to write about in my PhD. Because the Scottish Reformation is not a Reformation led by famous people. There's no Martin Luther, there's no John Calvin, there's no Huldrych Zwingli, there's no leading figure. Even John Knox is a much later figure. Who is keeping this new movement going are a group of people who meet in secret, they read the Bible, they sing, they pray, and as far as I can tell, they still go to Mass, which is an interesting conundrum. And so I use the word evangelical to describe them. Evangel is the word for gospel. It's used a lot in the 16th century for Luther's teaching. These are people who loved what Luther had to say. They did things that put them in danger for it, but they also continued to go to Mass. They don't see themselves as a church. They're somewhere in between. There's a little bit of a comparative case in France. There are a group of people in France who had written to John Calvin at one point. They say to Calvin, we don't want to get killed, so can we still go to Mass? Will that be okay? And Calvin, who was unwilling to negotiate at all on that, says, no, you can't. And he calls them Nicodemites, which if you know the story of Nicodemus, in John 3, Nicodemus comes to talk to Jesus and he goes back to the Sanhedrin. Calvin says, you're like Nicodemus. So I have proposed in my doctoral work that these Scottish evangelicals are a little like the French Nicodemites. They're people who love what Luther has to say. They do take risks because of it, but they still continue to go to Mass. Well, the exiles started returning. So the initial foray of Protestant teaching is 1520s. In the 1530s, we see a lot of people going into exile, a few martyrdoms. 1540s, that's going to pick up a little bit more. And then in the 1550s, some of the exiles start coming back. The most famous is John Knox. He's not the only one. And some of those exiles, they had spent years now ministering in contexts where they were in the reformed cities of Switzerland, or where they had been in England under Edward VI during one of England's Protestant phases. And they came back with the experience of having been in that Protestant world, and when they came back, they had these new ideas and they're willing to take leadership roles. And all this leads then, with a lot of complexity that I'm skipping over, especially with Mary Queen of Scots. Mary Queen of Scots fits into this because she's an absent queen. She was born in 1542. Her father, James V, then loses a terrible battle called Solway Moss and dies either from disease or depression afterwards. And his dying words are, "It came with a lass, and it will go with a lass." What is the it? It's the Stuart monarchy. He's convinced that the monarchy, from Robert the Bruce on down, that family is going to die with his daughter because a daughter can't rule as queen. Well, she proves him wrong. Mary is going to be whisked away to be raised in France. After a brief flirtation with a Protestant upbringing, she is going to be taken off to France. She'll grow up there. She marries the Dauphin, the heir to the crown of France. Way better than the crown of Scotland. I mean, way better. This is like becoming, it's like becoming king of I don't know. It's like becoming king of Bristol instead of Grundy. You know, it's just, I want to give Bristol the upper hand. No offense to Grundy. But it's a much, much better crown. This is a far more populous, more wealthy crown, and it's great. Unfortunately fortunately for her, when she is still a teenager, her husband becomes king because Henri II, her father-in-law, had been killed in a joust. Kimberly Brubaker Bradley's next novel is about this, by the way. And then, so Francois II, her husband, becomes the king. But then he gets an ear infection and he's dead within a year. Her mother-in-law, who is the queen mother and the grieving queen mother, is Catherine de' Medici, one of the most powerful women in Europe, who on no account wanted another queen in France. And so she's the one who ships Mary back to Scotland. Mary did not want to go back to Scotland. She arrived back in her homeland in 1560 on May the 2nd, which happens to be my birthday. Might just want to take a note of that. Some of y'all throw that out. She showed back up in Scotland, and she's into a country that is deeply divided now for a variety of reasons. Well, in 1560, the compromise that is going to be reached happens at Parliament. And at the Parliament, a Protestant confession of faith is going to be adopted. The Mass is going to be outlawed, and theoretically this reforms the country, but it doesn't really, because it's never signed by the Queen. It's never ratified. So there's a question about its legality. Also confusing is the fact that while it looks like the supporters of the Reformation are mostly followers of Calvin and therefore prefer the idea of a synod as the way they're going to organize their church, kind of a proto-Presbyterian church, 3 of the bishops converted. So what do you do with that? You have 3 bishops, Catholic bishops, who suddenly convert to Protestantism, so you have a weird mixed polity in the country. As the way they're going to organize their church, kind of a proto-Presbyterian church. 3 of the bishops converted. So what do you do with that? You have 3 bishops, Catholic bishops, who suddenly convert to Protestantism, so you have a weird mixed polity in the country. So all that is the coming of the Reformation. I did that in about 10 minutes, which is not bad. But all that is background for making the people who become the Scots-Irish. This is the stuff that they come out of. The first of the martyrs is Patrick Hamilton. This is a portrait made around 1700, which the one thing we know is that he looked nothing like this. So I just put it up there as a visual. No one wore facial hair like that in the 1520s, but there he is. However, this is where he was burned at the stake. He was the first martyr of the Scottish Reformation in 1528. He had come back. He's one of these exiles. He'd gone over to the University of Marburg. He had distinguished himself a little bit there. He came back to Scotland, started debating these ideas at the university. He's going to be accused of heresy, and he's going to be burned at the end of March in 1528. There, if you go to St. Andrews, which of course you're going to go to play golf, you might take time to go see this in the pavement, a PH, which is the place where he was burned. Hamilton had the unfortunate fate of being burned at the stake at the beginning of March. Sorry, I said the end of March. It's the beginning of March, end of February. Beginning of March in St. Andrews. If you've been in St. Andrews, it is an incredibly windy place and cold, and it makes it difficult to kill somebody by burning, because usually when you get burned at the stake, you suffocate. The suffocation will kill you before you suffer too long. Some of Hamilton's friends actually tried to help, and this is not uncommon. They put gunpowder around him in hopes that it would kill him faster so he wouldn't suffer as much. Unfortunately, it didn't work, and so he had a long and agonizing death. But as with so many of these martyrdoms, it has a dual effect. The martyrdom, on the one hand, looks like we're punishing this person and therefore you shouldn't do what he's done. On the other hand, he stays brave. And so one of my secondary doctoral supervisor wrote an article once called The Theater of Martyrdom. And she points out this is like watching a kind of performance, and it turns out that if the martyr pulls it off well, more people will be sympathetic to him than will be judgmental. And that was certainly the case with Hamilton. John Knox famously writes about this later. He says, he's quoting somebody else. He says, "My Lord, if you will burn any more, do it in deep cellars, for the reek, the smoke of Master Patrick Hamilton has infected as many as it blew upon." So martyrdom's a tricky thing. Hamilton's one. Another one that I happen to know a lot about is this guy, George Wishart. Wishart came about a decade later. He also had gone to the university, to universities abroad. He had been in Louvain, in Belgium now, which is a very leaned humanist. You could study Greek and Hebrew there, for example, not just Latin. And Wishart was going to come back, and he spends about 3 years in a secret, itinerant pastorate. He goes from place to friendly nobles, places he knows he will receive a friendly reception where he can stay and he can preach and he can do his thing and he won't be apprehended. So Wishart also, although met the same fate, there's a memorial to him in Dundee. If you ever go up to Dundee and Angus, he preached from this gate of the city during the plague. There was a plague outbreak, and of course nobody could come in or out, but Wishart gets up on the walls to preach to the plague victims. This also in St. Andrews is his memorial, so you can see him as well. There's a GW for George Wishart. And in 2013, as what we think is about the 500th anniversary of his birth, I was part of a conference, and I edited this little booklet on George Wishart. So, still available on Amazon. You can buy this, and I don't get anything out of this either, so you don't have to buy that one either. But Wishart I know a lot about. If you go to the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, I have a 3,500-word article about George Wishart in there. He's my guy. So there's the book. For the two martyrs plus a third martyr in 1559, there is a memorial in St. Andrews. The Old Course Golf Club is right behind that. So if you've been in St. Andrews to go see the golf course, you've been very near the Martyrs Memorial. In 1946, this was put up right at the end of the war, and it was a kind of hopeful moment. They put this thing up and they published a book with it to say, like these martyrs in the 16th century, we're looking forward to a better day, kind of thing. Anyway. So what are the things I think that define the people who are eventually going to move over here? One is a strong sense of Luther's teaching on salvation. Initially, very little discussion of the church, although that's going to change a lot. It was a movement defined by ordinary people, and I think that's a key to understanding the way this moves into the mountains here. It was a movement that did not require a strong organization or even a pastorate. And finally, something that does become very important for the Scots later, which is called the communion season. If you go to the Highlands of Scotland now, most Highland churches, Reformed churches, will only have communion twice a year. And you think to yourself, twice a year? And it's because they have an entire week of getting ready for it. It's called a communion season, and people will actually travel to other towns for the communion season. You go to church services on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. If you have not earned communion by the end of that, I don't know what's wrong with you, because that's a lot of church services. Those became a feature of Scottish Protestant practice that definitely come to the New World. There's a whole book about this by a historian called Lee Eric Schmidt called Holy Fairs. Excellent book, where he studies the way that that practice makes its way across the Atlantic. The Bible is another feature of this, and I'll go through this a little faster. This book, I'm not in. It's no longer in print, but my doctoral supervisor, David Wright, edited this, and it has lots of good stuff about the Bible and Scottish life and literature. It has a great effect, of course, on many more things than the Reformation itself. I want to give you one little brief prehistory because it was in the news. The only attempt in the 16th century to make a Bible that was in Scots rather than English was done in the late 1400s, as far as we can tell. We can't date it. And it was a version based on the work of John Wycliffe. You may know the Wycliffite followers. The Lollards, Wycliffe never translated himself, but his followers translated two versions of the Bible into English, Middle English. It would feel like not Chaucer, but a little later. And so the Scots version was made somewhere in the 1400s, and this is something that I spent a lot of time with in my PhD. Because what I discovered was that this Scots version of a 15th century Bible translation then had 16th century notes put into the margins, Protestant notes. And as a little side note, this is something that meant a lot to 15 people worldwide, but I'll share it with you now. I spent a long time discovering this. All the notes are straight out of they're copied right out of an English Bible. They all are very Protestant, except there's one note that he left out, the Scottish person who was doing this. And it's a note on swearing. It's in the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus says, let your yes be yes, your no be no. The note in the margin says it's actually okay to swear because swearing was important for court procedure in the 16th century. But it's the only one left out, which leads me to believe it was deliberately left out, and it turns out these people who followed Wycliffe, the Lollards, did not approve of swearing. And so I was able to say, look, these people, whatever else they may have been, they still have a weird Lollard identity as late as the 1530s, which was, again, those 15 people were just throwing their hats in the air when I came out with that. Your response is a little more sober, but that's all right. I don't mind that so much. So this is a page out of, we think that the translator was a man called Murdoch Nisbet. He was a notary public, lived in Ayrshire in the southwest. This is interesting at the minute because it made the news. When King Charles III received the crown of the honors of Scotland in St. Giles High Church in Edinburgh, not St. Giles Cathedral, by the way, it never was. There was never a bishop. When he went to St. Giles, he'd already been crowned at Westminster. He came north and he was presented with the crown and the scepter and the sword of Scotland. At that ceremony, there was a reading from the New Testament, and they decided to read from that. And so that's the reading from the order of service for King Charles III back in the summer. And it's the Beatitudes. And it's a little bit of Scots spelling, but you can make your way through it. So this is a 15th century translation that made its way into that. So this is a 15th century translation that made its way into that. Other Bibles then come in, but all the other Bibles that came into Scotland are English. Because it turns out you can use it. You can read English just fine if you can read Scots. Now that means we're in the lowlands, not in the highlands, right? because in the Highlands, they don't speak Scots. I have watched a man called Jamie Reed Baxter, who's a great Scottish historian. I was at a conference once, and he got up and he read from the Geneva Bible, which was published in 1560. It's by the English exile community there. It's a great monumental work in the history of the Bible. It was the Bible of Shakespeare. It's the Bible of the Pilgrims. Nobody knows about it, but it's a very important translation. Jamie got up and off the cuff translated into Scots as he read. It's not that difficult to do. So there was no need to publish a Scots Bible, and therefore there's not another one that comes out. I put this slide up for two sentimental reasons, just to show you some other 16th century Bibles. The main reason is that the man on the left, who died on Christmas Day last year, presented once to the Bristol Historical Association. He's called Michael Morgan, and he was an internationally recognized collector of Bibles. He was a great friend to King as well. He came up several times to bring he'd put these priceless books into the back of his little Nissan and drive them up, and he'd set them out, and so he presented in here once. And I put this picture in because Chris Slaughter is also in it. Since he's not here in person, I at least got a picture of him in the presentation on the right. So preaching, briefly. Preaching is something that when you follow on the theology and the emphasis on the Bible, that emphasis on the Bible, by the way, it's hard to quantify easily, but I did bring this book too. I forgot to put a picture of it in. It's a whole book. I have a chapter in here on that manuscript New Testament. But one of the contention of the editors of this book is that while the Scots did not like visual art, and they get infamous for this, that they did not like to have, they would smash stained glass and they would break statues and they would do things like this, and yet what they do have is a verbal artistry that comes out of their use of Scripture. And Knox is great. I don't know if you've ever read any John Knox. He's an unpleasant person in many ways, but he's funny and he is a great, great writer. He can be mordantly sarcastic. He can be occasionally elevated, but you can see the way that verbal artistry translates over. Anyway, so I think part of the inheritance for us in the mountains is that we get Bible-shaped language. Such that if you read sources from the 1800s or the 1900s, you're going to find them replete with references to the Bible that you cannot get unless you know it. I have a friend who teaches American history at Edinburgh. He says he assigns his students several passages out of the New Testament before he gives them Lincoln's second inaugural, because they won't understand it otherwise. They've got to get the references. Well, this language, the language of the Scots, who become the Scots-Irish, or the Ulster Scots, is shaped by the Bible. I think that's a significant feature of that inheritance. Preaching, too, and preaching is something that I don't know the history of the Appalachians enough to know how this shifted in. But preaching is important to Knox. This, by the way, is a picture of Knox, not the guy in the fancy clothes. He's the guy with the sword at the front, because at this point he is going in front of George Wishart, the man I mentioned earlier. Knox worked for Wishart for about 3 months, and it became extremely formative for Knox. And he would carry this sword in front of him. Knox was not a trained swordsman. He was a schoolmaster. So what he would have done with the sword, I'm not sure. But he did go carrying this sword in front of Wishart for a while. That's obviously a much later painting. Here's the statue you see if you go into my old college, New College, Edinburgh. And the old joke at Edinburgh is he showing you the door or is he welcoming you in? We're not quite sure which it is. But that statue stands in the courtyard. We're not quite sure what Knox looked like. There are 2 woodcut versions of him that came out in successive years in a book called Icones by Theodore Beza in Geneva. And one looks like this, and the other he has a short pointy beard. And we're not quite sure which is correct. But that's the one that we're more aware of. If you've been to Edinburgh, you may have seen the Knox house. He didn't own this, but he rented a floor in it. And it's the oldest standing house in Edinburgh. But he spends a lot of time in pulpits. Pulpits are often raised in Scottish churches at the time, so you get the soundboard at the top that reflects your voice so you can be heard. And preaching takes on a very important role in the Scottish Protestant church. Here are a couple of examples of what these sermons are like. George Wishart, the guy who was martyred in 1546, Here is an account from Knox of Wishart's final sermon. He should have begun to have entreated the second table of the law. That is, he's going to go through the back half of the Ten Commandments. But thereof in that sermon he spake very little. In such vehemency and threatening continued that servant of God near an hour and a half. In the end he said, I have forgotten myself in the matter I should have entreated. Therefore he made a short paraphrase upon the second table with an exhortation. Happy to tell you that I'm not going to hold forth for an hour and a half tonight. You'll be relieved to know as we turn in. So there's a lot of vehemency in the preaching. It's also extemporaneous. And I did a paper on this several years ago, and it was a real surprise to me. Up until almost the 1900s, among the Scots, there is a disdain for writing a sermon out. They don't think you should write it out. You should be scholarly. You should be able to present your studied, careful reflections on the text. But if you had written out a manuscript, that was seen as a kind of negative. That was a surprise to me. So that sense of extemporaneous preaching is important for the Scots at the time. Here is an account then of Knox himself. This is James Melville, one of Knox's friends. I had my pen in my little book and took away such things as I could comprehend. So he's taking notes. Incidentally, that's how the sermons get published in the 16th century. You see volumes of the sermons of Luther or Calvin. They didn't write them out. They're preaching extemporaneously and people take notes. So that's why you get the published sermons. Only one sermon of Knox's was ever published. The rest we know about only at second hand. So he's taking notes. In the opening up of his text, he was so moderate, the space of a half hour. He was moderate, so he's, starting slow. But when he entered to application, he made me so to grow and tremble. To grow is related to the word to greet, he's afraid, that I could not hold a pen to write. I heard him oftentimes utter these threatenings in the height of their pride, which the eyes of many saw clearly brought to pass within few years. He's a pretty engaging preacher. Melville can't even write. Being in St. Andrews, he was very weak. This is Knox's last sermon. Being in St. Andrews, he was very weak. I saw him every day of his doctrine go hooly, I think is a term for kind of going crazy. And fear from the abbey to the parish church, and by the said Richard, this is a person we have talked about earlier in the text, and another servant lifted up to the pulpit. So he's so weak he has to be lifted up to that pulpit, which is up the stairs, where he behooved to lean at his first entry. But before he had done with his sermon, he was so active and vigorous that he was like to ding that pulpit in blads and fly out of it. So he's pretty vigorous in his preaching. Well, that may sound a little Appalachian to you. And it's funny because we don't associate the Presbyterians now. I do a lot of Presbyterian preaching, and I can assure you I have never done anything like this. But this is the roots. I do a lot of Presbyterian preaching, and I can assure you I have never done anything like this. But this is the roots that come over. Here's a bit of poetry about Knox as a preacher. For well I know that Scotland never bore in Scots tongue, lead as language, a man more eloquent into persuading, also I am sure, was none in Europe that was more potent. In Greek and Hebrew he was so excellent, and also in Latin tongue his properness was tried trim when scoffers were present, but these were nothing to his uprightness. It's terrible poetry, but it is poetry nonetheless about Knox as a preacher. So the strong emphasis here on his potency. Also, an attempt to point out his ability in languages, which is probably not true. We don't think that Knox actually knew any Greek or Latin, or Greek or Hebrew. He knew Latin, and he knew French. But we don't think that he was capable in Greek or Hebrew. But later on, this guy wants to remember him as such. And also, when it comes to application, he is bold. He would not wane any why. He wouldn't budge a bit. For any man's will for to rebuke earl, baron, or burgess, which in their wicked ways they walked still. So he's pretty bold. Let me go through this one very quickly because I want to get the last bit in. Kirk and the Crown. You probably know that Knox has many interviews with Mary Queen of Scots. He was remarkably allowed access to the Queen. They're going to go in and debate theology, and they have these showdowns a few times. Knox had already gotten himself in a tremendous amount of trouble with Elizabeth south of the border. Queen Elizabeth, just as Knox is finishing a book talking about how awful Mary Tudor, Bloody Mary, Elizabeth's sister, was, and Mary of Guise, the Queen Mother in Scotland. They're Catholic female monarchs, and he can't stand them. So he writes a book that draws on 16th century prejudice against women. It's called The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women. Monstrous regiment does not mean lots of women. It means rule. And so he writes this book, and almost immediately Elizabeth came onto the throne, and she was not amused with this book. Knox writes her trying to say, oh, I didn't mean you, and she doesn't buy it, so he can't go back to England. But remarkably, he is given access to Mary Queen of Scots. They have these showdowns, but it begins a pattern for the Scots Church of a very strong sense that you need to be independent from the state, that it is a desire, even with a Protestant state, you want to be independent. This is going to be a different kind of reformation from what's happening in Lutheran territories. It's going to be a different kind of reformation from what happened in the Swiss cities, because these individuals are very suspicious of the government. Fast forwarding to the 1630s, if you've been to St. Giles, you may know this. In 1637, another example of this, a woman called Jenny Geddes. There's a man who comes to the pulpit in St. Giles at the orders of King Charles I to read from the prayer book. Well, we're Presbyterians at St. Giles. We don't like the prayer book. And so this woman called Jenny Geddes, a washerwoman who had brought her stool to sit in because there are no pews in a 16th century church, she hurls the stool at the pulpit and tells him that she will not have any of this popery in her church, and a riot ensued. It's called the Prayer Book Riot of 1637. So again, a strong sense of pushing back on a monarch, Charles I, who wants to get involved. The following year, the National Covenant was signed in 1638. This is an agreement of many nobles that they are going to continue to struggle to preserve the independence of the Kirk. Now here, that old divide is going to reemerge because there are two kinds of Protestant in Scotland. There are Protestant Presbyterians and there are Protestant Episcopalians. And the Episcopalians are okay with the king, the Presbyterians are not. I mean, they don't mind having a king, but they're very much willing to challenge the king. A man called Andrew Melville, one of Knox's successors in the 1600s, or late 1500s, gets an audience with James VI, who will become James I, King James of the King James Bible. During the audience, he actually has the temerity to grasp the sleeve of the king, tug on his sleeve, and call him God's silly vassal. You're God's silly vassal. Well, that's the thing that you know is going to get you thrown in prison, and it did. But it shows you the sense that these Scots have a sense of suspicion and a desire to be independent from the state. Finally, the second sighted Scots. Now, this is the one that I think has intrigued me but I have not had time to go into the Appalachian side of it. But very briefly, if you can bear with me a moment. Second sight is a reference to some form of foreseeing the future. And in the history of Scotland, this goes way back. I happen to have encountered this first with a friend who's very, very Presbyterian. And she also says she has second sight. She has given me numerous examples of having seen something in advance. She claims to have known the sex of every baby of her friends before it was born. She is absolutely adamant in this, and it's a weird marriage because we tend to think of Scottish Presbyterians as very much kind of flowing into the Enlightenment, that they are very much not about things like this, and yet it turns out they are. Now, the tricky thing with the Scots is figuring out what is second sight, what is an appropriation of Old Testament prophecy, and how do those two intersect? And I tried to do that in a research project several years ago. I never solved it. It does go way back, though. St. Columba, who died in 597, long time ago. This is the guy who came from basically modern Derry in Northern Ireland, went across to Iona and started a community on Iona, which is still there. Columba, if you read the life of Columba, two things stand out. One is he rebukes a sea creature in the River Ness, which is the earliest example of the Loch Ness Monster. The other is, over and over again, he predicts the future. The thing that is his miracle is not healing the sick. It's not performing other kinds of miracles. It's prophecy, over and over again. So this is deeply embedded somehow in the Scots. Miracles, it's prophecy, over and over again. So this is deeply embedded somehow in the Scots. And that's 1,000 years before the Reformation. In the 13th century, there's another famous example of this that we know of because it got written down. A man called Thomas the Rhymer, or he's also called Thomas of Ercildoune. And Thomas is somebody who writes these long prophecies. He gets whisked away to the land of faerie. And when he's there, of course, the land of faerie in the 16th century, or in the 13th century, is a dangerous place. It's not a happy place with, Tinkerbell. This is a place of menacing creatures, but he is given the ability to predict the future, and he loses the ability to lie, which is an interesting kind of mixture of things. So here is a painting of Thomas meeting the Queen of Fairies. The painting I throw up there because it's a famous school of art. If you don't know the Immortals, these were Glasgow artists at the end of the 19th century who are fantastic. Charles Rennie Mackintosh is the most famous, beautiful design work in the late 19th, early 20th century. Catherine Cameron did this painting. So it's an old tradition, and it turns out George Wishart and John Knox, you don't get much more Presbyterian, you don't get much more Reformed than Wishart and Knox, and they both claim to be prophets. So the question I had to ask was, is this because of a folk tradition that they have maintained, or is this something that they're blending into an understanding of Old Testament prophecy? It's hard to know. But Knox says this of his mentor, Wishart. He was so clearly illuminated with the spirit of prophecy that he saw not only things pertaining to himself, but also such things as some towns in the whole realm afterward felt, which he forespake not in secret, but in the audience of many. Our poet, John Davidson, later on Knox, there was no trouble come to thee, that is the church in Edinburgh he's referring to, but he forespake it openly. There's a strong sense that with these very, very Reformed Protestant characters, that they foresee the future. Other Protestants in the Reformed world do not do this. Calvin sees himself as a prophet. Actually, a friend of mine just did a book on this a couple of years ago, John Balserac. And so Calvin has this sense, but it's more in the sense of the Old Testament prophet. It's not so much in the sense of predicting the future as it is speaking to power. Forthtelling rather than foretelling, if you know that distinction for the prophetic word. But in the Scots case, it's forthtelling. The most interesting case of this is this guy. And it's also my best slide. This is a mask worn by a man called Alexander Peden. Now, Peden was a 17th century figure. He's a Covenanter, a follower a century later of all those people I talked about, Knox, Wishart, Hamilton, etc. Peden is somebody who was on the run most of his career because he, like the other Scots, had a strong distaste for royal authority. And the royal authority that he was up against was Charles II. So after 1660, when Charles II is brought back in, you may remember the interregnum comes before this. Oliver Cromwell had not worked out well. The Parliament recalls Charles II. Charles II had made some deals with the Scots. He broke all of them. And he wants to govern Scotland according to his own desires. Well, the Presbyterians, who were Covenanters, did not like this, and you end up with some civil war. It ends up in a time in the late 1680s called the Killing Times, which resulted in a lot of martyrdom of the Covenanters. If you go into Edinburgh and go to an area called the Grass Market, you can still see a monument for the Covenanters. Well, one of the Covenanters was Alexander Peden. We don't have a likeness of him. We don't know what he looked like. But weirdly, this mask survives, which he wore. It was discovered about 200 years after his death with some of his stuff in a family home. It has some human hair. It has some human teeth. If you look closely, it has a wig in the back. I'll show you another picture in a second. And he wore this. I'll come back to why in a second. Most people will say, this is a disguise. I don't think that's much of a disguise. My feeling is if you were the authorities and you saw somebody wearing that, the only way that's a disguise is if you think, well, no, that's not Alexander Peden. That is, in fact, the local axe murderer, because that's what it looks like. It's terrifying. It's not a disguise, I think. Well, I'll go ahead and tell you my theory. My theory is he put this on so that when the troops coming after him would go to a local farm or a local village and say, have you seen Alexander Peden? They could say no, because they hadn't seen his face. I think he wore it not as a disguise so much as a covering. But that's my theory. I have nothing to back that up, but I like my theory. Peden would go around to places like this. There are lots of places that survive on the southwest of Scotland and also in Northern Ireland where he went. Peden caves or stains of stones where he would preach. He preached in the open. He would go out and about and do his preaching and his work. But all along the way, the thing that people remembered about Alexander Peden was that he prophesied. If you read his life was written in the 1710s by a writer called Patrick Walker. Walker went all around Scotland collecting stories of the Covenanters, also into Northern Ireland. And as he traveled around these places, he got story after story of the Covenanters. And almost everything that was remembered about this guy was that he prophesied things. He would predict things. Now, it is the way of things. Actually, Francis Bacon in the 16th century writes an essay about this. When it comes to remembering things like this, you remember the success stories. And so it makes this look great. People don't remember the things that maybe he didn't get right, but they remember the things that he did get right, and they stand out because you think, oh my gosh, he said this. Two stood out particularly for Peden. Most of his prophecy is negative. Most of it's about the crown. Charles II is going to come to ruin. Charles II is going to go down. Most of that's the case. But he also will prophesy about ordinary people. Two of them come from weddings. There's a wedding Peden is performing. The bride and groom come forward, and he says to the woman, enjoy him while you can. You're not going to have him long. Soon your wedding clothes will turn to a funeral shroud. And sure enough, about 3 years later, this guy got shot to death by Charles's men. So people said, look, here's a prediction. The other one is my favorite. He goes up to marry this young couple, and Peden in full prophetic form, the couple comes up to the front, and he says, I'm quoting here, do not marry her, for she is a whore and a thief. He says this at the beginning of the wedding, and then apparently, as far as the account goes, proceeds to do the wedding, which is kind of awkward, I think, if you've already done this awkward moment, and then he continues with the marriage. So he's an interesting, wild guy. He's very Protestant in his theology. He's very suspicious of state authority. He places great emphasis on the Bible, and his language is that of the Bible. And he also has this weird experience of second sight. So Peden, for me, is a kind of transitional figure. And this, I think, is where we begin to see something of the people who, some of whom moved to Ulster, to the plantations under James VI, and then a bunch of them ended up coming to the New World. And when they came to the New World, I think all those tendencies, all those trends stayed with them when they settled here in the mountains, and especially as they open up after 1763 and they start pushing west. I think they brought this with them. So, to sum up, the Bible in language, thought, and debate, I think is a feature of our Scottish roots for Appalachian religion, an emphasis on simplicity. The Scots are not big on, their churches are not adorned. Their ministers are not adorned fancily. They have a very simple form of worship, preaching extempore, but very learned, a sense of spiritual independence from the state, the tradition of second sight, and finally singing. And I've taken my full time, but I want to impose this extra 30 seconds or so on you because it's so interesting to me, and I bet you've never heard it. What the Scots sing is psalms exclusively. By the time they moved over to the New World, they did not do hymns. They were convinced that because hymns are not mentioned in the New Testament, you shouldn't sing them. You should only sing the Psalter. And so they had a book of metrical psalms. We still sing the old hundredth, that tune, which we now sing with the doxology often, but it was actually a setting for Psalm 100. They sang the psalms, and those became a kind of way of filtering the world. We underrate how well the Scots knew their psalms and how much the psalms mean, because the psalms take you every step of the way through your life and your emotions, from joy to anger, from sorrow to persecution to vindication. They take you through all these experiences, this marvelous songbook. And the Scots, because they invested themselves so much in the Psalms, they really knew them. And they become the songbook of the Scots Church, and they brought it with them when they came over here. Just because it's interesting to me, and I think you'll find it interesting as well, I want to finish with a little bit of the psalmody of the Highlands, though. Because the psalmody that came over here was psalmody of the Lowlands in the Scots language. So I'm going to show you very briefly a little bit of a Scots psalm from the Highlands, just because I bet you haven't seen this before.
I'd like to welcome you all to our church here in Back on the island of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides, where over the next 2 evenings we hope to record what we feel is one of the most unique musical forms to be found anywhere in the world, and that is unaccompanied Gaelic psalm singing. But although we gather here together for this unique recording, we will always have in our minds that firstly and foremostly we are here to praise God. Good God.
And it goes on like that for a long time, so I'm going to cut that off. That's the music of the Highlands. There are people who will claim that you can see resonance of that as well when you come over to the New World. I think it's a little trickier to see, but it's an interesting little tradition. But the singing is a major part of that tradition. I don't really have an ending. That's where I've got to. I have tried your patience. You have stuck with me, and I appreciate that very much. If you have any questions, I'm happy to take those. If your question is, please, can we leave? That's okay too. So, thank you.